Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 29th edition of the Dubrovnik Economic Conference. Many of you have been here before. Some of you are here for the first time. So let me just give you a brief history of the conference. It started, well, 29 years ago. We didn't skip any during the COVID, so that's important to mention. We even did it in 2020 and 2021. Which means that it started during the war, which also means that there was a war in Europe before the Ukraine war, after the Second World War, which lasted 5 years, and we started just about the end of that war with the conference, and there's at least one person here, or two, who were there during the first conference, and when the shells were still heard from the city around, because the front line was very, very close by. It started as a conference on the transition. It was a time of the transition. But then after some years, we transitioned out of the transition and decided it doesn't make sense anymore to call it a transition conference. And now it's just the Dubrovnik Economic Conference. The difference this year is that for the first time, we do it as a part of the Eurosystem, as we enter the Eurozone, as you know, on the 1st of January of this year, which is a great thing for us. But having the conference in Dubrovnik, I also have to say that Dubrovnik had a mint here, so-called zeka, from 14th century until 19th century, and was minting a very appreciated currency at that time. So it's not the first time we have a hard currency here. They had it before. Then we had a period when it was not that hard. And that's where we also learned what the inflation is and how it behaves. And that helps us a little bit today with understanding the inflation that we see. Dubrovnik was also, it was a small open economy, of course, but with a very also solid state finance. Public finances were one of the strengths of the Republic. And this is also something that I can talk a lot about, but I don't have time. But we learn also from them about the good policies in a small open economy, both in terms of the structural policies that they had, and I must say they had a policy of subsidizing the shipbuilding here, which we inherited in the former Yugoslavia and Croatia, but it didn't work anymore. So you can do if you do the subsidies in the right way, they work actually. But if you do them in the wrong way, they don't work. We also have, we had a 16th edition yesterday of the YES, Young Economy Seminar, which we started then 16 years ago. Giovanni was there, a number of you, where we invite the papers from the young economists from the European Union. So out of the, I think, around 30 applications. We choose 6 papers that were presented yesterday, and I've heard that you've chosen also the winner paper, which we will announce tomorrow at the dinner and give a little award that we set up. So thanks for everyone who participated in the YES, and I'm glad that we have all the participants with us here. For this conference, of course, we every year try, as you know, to be up to date, so to tackle the most important and contemporary issues. The first panel will deal, of course, with the question for all the central bankers: when will inflation converge back to the target? But we also have sessions on the labor market. Why is it so resilient? We also will look at the interaction between the fiscal and monetary policies. And finally, we'll have a panel which was not planned initially. We planned to have a panel on the macroeconomic forecasting and the high-frequency microdata. But then there was a Silicon Valley Bank, there was a Credit Suisse, and then we said, okay, we cannot miss the banks this time. So we have a panel on the banking issues. We're going to asked the panel there on whether what we saw has happened a month ago, 2 months ago, is idiosyncratic, or we might have systemic problems. We also have a bunch of very interesting papers. We have a special keynote lecture on a broader perspective of the economic growth. We will be looking in one of the papers also at how the financing conditions affect the prices, which is one of the things that the ECB looks at when we decide on the interest rate hikes or not. So I hope that over the next 2 days we're going to have an interesting conference as usual. So with that, I would like to switch to our first panel. And I will start. Huh? Yeah. Yeah. Ah, yes. Yeah. Very good. Since we have become a member of the Euro system, we have new rules at the conference. So the rules have changed. The panels are for the press. Panels are something, introductory statements that you can quote right away. It's fully open, but the Q&A we keep under the Chatham House rules, which means that in order to make the Q&A more interesting, that means that you can only quote the things from the Q&A if you later ask the panelists about the quote. So basically you have to ask them after the panel what you can quote. But what is said in the introductory part of the panel, that's fully open. So let me start with the introduction to the panel. So very quickly, just to set the stage for the panel, I'm going to go through few slides. One is if you remember last year, we had a panel on inflation as well, with the central bankers from the Central and East Europe, and we had a nice discussion between Jan Schweiner and the Czech Central Bank. If you remember, almost a fight, where Jan was saying that the Czech Central Bank was raising the rates too quickly, and he said that the reason why the inflation is so high in Czech Republic is because they were increasing the rates so quickly. So then some people called it an Erdogan argument. But what you see here is that really the Central and East European countries started to raise rates much earlier as a response to the inflationary pressures than the advanced major central banks and economies. Now, much of the answer to this development of the interest rates is probably in the interest rate parity argument, because they have to care about the exchange rate while the large central banks don't. And Croatia is in a way lucky now, because we were on the road to the euro already last year. So our interest rate and inflation development is much more like the Eurozone than the Hungary, Czech Republic, or Poland. And then if you look at the inflation development, we see that the headline is coming down, but that as the underlying inflation pressures are still present. One thing that I will also ask the panelists is why did we miss so much in forecasts? If you look at the forecast errors from mid-21, they were large, but in a way, I think it's something that you can expect, because we had a discussion in the ECB if anything, these errors are unbiased. So at the time when the inflation undershoots, we always predict it's going to be 2%. When it overshoots, we always predict it's going to be 2% 2 years down the road. But of course, when the deviation is higher, then the forecast errors are higher. The question, of course, now is how strong are underlying inflationary pressures. And we still see, if you look here at the 3-month annualized price increases, that the food and services are where, if I look at this graph, is questionable whether we're going to be with these pressures at 2% within next 2 years. But this is a question for a panel. It's luxury to be a chair, so I don't have to. I can ask the questions rather than answer them. The monetary policy pass-through is there, but the pass-through is very different across the Eurozone countries. Here you can see the deposit betas, and you can see the pass-through on the credit rates. This is basically deposit and credit rates changes based on 1% increase in the policy rate. And you can see that there's a lot of difference when you look at both time deposits and even more so when you look at the credit rates, both to the corporates and the households, which might be a problem for a currency union if you have such a heterogeneity of the pass-through of the policy. One criterion that we look at when deciding on the interest rate, which we said explicitly, is also credit condition. We look at the BLS. This is the credit standards for corporates, and you can see that they have tightened significantly. If you look at the demand side, you see that the rate increases have had a significant effect on the demand, plus, of course, the slowdown in the economic activity. And on the supply side, you see that it's more risk perception than the costs of financing for the banks that has impact for the moment on the tightening of the credit standards. But we'll hear in the paper in the next session that it's not unambiguous how the credit standards might affect the prices, because the paper will look at the financial shocks impact on the price decisions of the companies. In terms of the lending, we see a slowdown. But here I look at a little bit longer perspective, not last 2 years. And when we look at the year-on-year growth of lending to corporate sector, or if you look at the momentum, I would say that the conclusion for me, at least for the moment still, is not straightforward what's going on, because if you look at the 2 countries within the Eurozone which had the slowest or negative rate of growth of credit to the corporates, they have had very low rates or negative for a long period of time, basically since the great financial crisis. So the question is, whether it's something that is caused by the tightening of the monetary policy, or it's maybe not. And if you look at the momentum, there you see that, again, if you take a longer perspective, it might not be that we're in a cyclically very different position than we were before, particularly because in the last reading you see actually momentum changing. So I would think we still need more data before we make firm conclusions. That's going to be also a question for the panel. Now, if you look at the expectations from the SMA, then this is the answer to the question of the panel. But I'm going to also, Andreas is laughing, I'm going to ask the panel also whether they firmly believe in that and what are the risks to these expectations. Of course, the expectations of the monetary policy are then correlated with the expectations of the inflation developments. The markets expect a relatively, I would say, quick monetary policy pivot at the moment. And finally, last point, which is more something for the last panel on the banks. That's the bank profitability and the financial market stress. I would say this is less important in European case than the US. Financial distress indicator comes down and the profitability of the banks in Europe goes up. And from what we see now is that the profitability of the banking system will be very high, not only this year, but for the couple of years ahead of us. And I don't think that at the moment we should worry so much about the banks, but you never know. It's, at the beginning of the year, I don't think people expected to see the problems that we saw later on. However, I think that the underlying situation in the European banking system is much better than we see across the Atlantic. And you can also see that the actually return on equity increases. It's a kind of secular trend of the increase in the return. It's going to be just now boosted by the income that the banks will get from keeping these large excess liquidity with the central bank. And with that, I'm gonna end my introductory statement, and we'll pass the floor to Giovanni Dell Ariccia, who will speak about the broad world picture rather than Europe, and then I'll switch to Philip to give us the view on Europe.
Well, good morning, everybody, and let me thank the governor and everybody else that contributed to the organization of this conference for the kind invitation. By the way, I was here yesterday at the Young Economists conference, but to be specific, I was not one of the young economists, I'm sorry. Didn't win the prize either. So what I'm gonna say, just for the press in the room, this is not going to deviate much from the WIO that we released just about a month ago. So let me start. Since the last quarter of 2022 and first quarter of 23, activity has been recovering somewhat after the adverse shocks associated with Russia's invasion of Ukraine at the beginning of last year. Confidence, however, remains quite low across both sides of the Atlantic. This has been, reflecting in labor markets that are still very tight. Here, I'm plotting the change in the vacancy to unemployment ratios relative to just the last quarter before the pandemic, and you see that in many regions, this ratio is still very tight, especially in the United States. This reflects both resilient labor markets and an increase in activity, but also a shift in the beverage curve, which is not entirely explained, is associated with sectoral shocks, but also maybe a loss in allocational efficiency. Because of this, inflation has been declining, especially the CPI, but it remains way above target, and core inflation has proved very sticky, much stickier than expected, as Boris just showed in terms of forecast errors over the past few quarters. This, in part, is reflecting high services inflation as the economies reallocate resources and demand from goods to services with the reopening and the end of the pandemic. But I will recommend everybody, this is off script from the wheel, but Ben Bernanke and Olivier Blanchard just released what I consider a terrific paper on this topic about the United States, but I think it's really worth reading if you're interested in these issues. From the policy perspective, central banks have been tightening monetary policy very aggressively and much faster than in the previous monetary policy cycle. Here on the left-hand side, we are charting the monetary policy tightening in this cycle vis-a-vis the one right before the GFC, and you see that is an order of magnitude different. This has helped maintaining inflation expectations well anchored, both in advanced economies, emerging markets, and low-income countries. This has been a very synchronous tightening across the globe with very few deviations. And to some extent, this is contributing to keeping inflation in check as you have multiplying effects. Now, that said, until, as late as January of this year, at least for the United States, markets were not completely buying the story that the central bank was selling, and they were pricing the policy rate path well below what the Fed was communicating. Then in January, and I don't know if on the screen is black or green, it was supposed to be green, but in January, markets repriced the policy path upward in getting much closer to what the Fed was communicating. However, then we had SVB, we had a couple of other regional banks in the United States getting in trouble. We had the adverse event in Switzerland, and the policy rate path was repriced again, this time downward, with a major shift in expectations about where the policy rate would peak. And in the United States, markets started pricing actually some rate cuts for this year. Going back to the financial distress episode, this is to some extent the result of the very fast tightening of policy rate and a financial sector that is coming out of a very, very long period of low rates. The question is, and I think this is an open question and it's a question for the panel, is how much equivalence you can make between tightening through a policy rate move and tightening through financial sector distress. So to some extent, there is an equivalence in the sense that the spread between the policy rate and the lending rates goes up, and so there is less burden on the policy rate to contain inflation, but the degree of uncertainty on the multipliers is much greater. So going to the forecast, what are the assumptions behind the most recent WIO forecast? Well, first, we are updating our own policy rate path upward, reflecting the stickier than expected core inflation in many regions. We are also assuming that the fiscal stimulus associated with the pandemic is going to be withdrawn, but very, very gradually. From the point of view of side assumptions, we are assuming that the war in Ukraine is not going to get significantly worse. We are assuming that the reopening of China stays on track and that the financial distress we just witnessed is not going to spread further. So based on those assumptions, we see growth bottoming out in 2023 at 2.8% globally. Bear in mind that this is a full 1 percentage point below average growth in the 2 decades preceding the pandemic, which was about at 3.8. It was between 3.7 and 3.9. So it is slow growth for this year and a very mild recovery next year. Unemployment in advanced economies will go up somewhat, and this will have spillovers on the rest of the world. In terms of inflation, which is the focus of the panel, we see inflation coming down in 3/4 of countries in 2023, so 75%, from, I think, 8.7 to 7% on average. But then, especially core, is going to stay high for a little bit longer. So we predict core to drop just a fraction of a point, I think 0.2. And while next year most countries will be still above target, the deviation from target on average will be much smaller, about 1 percentage point. Most countries will go very close to target or at target in 2025. Risks to this scenario are relatively significant in terms of growth. In the short run, risks associated with a potentially much tighter financial conditions associated with balance sheet distress, the potential for the need for further hikes because of stickier than expected inflation, possible stress on sovereign debt markets in emerging and low-income countries, a possible slowdown in China, and an intensification of the war in Ukraine, all compounded by the trend that we are seeing in geoeconomic fragmentation. From the point of view of inflation, in the short term, we factor the risk of overshooting again relative to expectations, and then things should converge down. Now I'm going to deviate from the wheel for my last slide, and I just wanted to leave with some more cheerful comment. And I think that there are, if you look a little bit deeper, there are potential reasons for optimism in terms of avoiding much further, much longer inflation. One, and this is not from fund war, so all disclaimers apply, please, to the press. There are obviously mitigating effects on wage pressures coming from work from home. This may apply more to the United States than Europe, but I've seen papers estimating premia up to 8% for people that would accept wages 8% lower in order to work from home and save in commuting costs and childcare and things like that. So this should help avoiding wage price spirals. Similarly, in a recent study, has been shown that the role of profit margins relative to wages in this inflation episode is much larger than in the inflation episodes of the 70s. And so, at least in theory, you would imagine that we can have some catch-up of real wages without that turning again into a push on prices. And finally, in one of the WEO chapters, we show that there is little reason to believe that in the long term, the natural rate of interest has moved much. And so there is a relatively high probability that we are going to go back to a situation pretty much like that in the Great Moderation. So for the sake of time, I'll stop here, and I think Phil is next. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we're going to zoom in on Europe, Philip.
I hope I still have it.
So I can give you an immediate answer. Inflation will return to target in a timely manner. Of course, I share a lot of the points that both were made by the first two speakers. But what I want to do is to go through the ingredients we look at, which really are three components. One is the outlook, which is basically a mix of the projections that the staff make, but also the outlook is not just the most likely path, it's the risk outlook as well. And we've listed in our recent meeting the list of upside risks and some downside risks that we would look at. The second component is to basically learn from what we actually see in the recent inflation data. Because there is a lot of uncertainty, and in particular the uncertainty about the, if you like, the intrinsic persistence of inflation. Because there was several pretty large shocks, which, if you like, ignited inflation. And everything we know means that it doesn't kind of burn out overnight. There's always going to be an impulse response function, if you like, a schedule where the adjustment does take time. But it should return to target, especially when inflation is above target, because we don't have a lower bound problem from above. And Boris, I think, was being a little bit semi-serious when he said the answer is always 2% 2 years from now. But that's kind of because that's we have we're not bystanders. We do have a policy instrument to inject anti-inflationary pressure to bring inflation back, as I said, in a timely manner. And I have let me be clear here, what I'm going to do in terms of the outlook is explain the March situation. Now, in our May meeting, we basically said the March situation, as of now, is still relevant. So in other words, from a European point of view, the excitement in the banking sector in March has not led to any kind of conclusive revisions. Now, of course, the forecasting process is ongoing for the June meeting. But I'm going to anchor what I say in terms of the outlook, in terms of our March assessment. Now, it's a very interesting episode. As Giovanni just said, I mean, there are some unique features which come back to the pandemic, come back to the nature of a war and an energy shock and so on. So, we rely a lot on historical examples, we rely a lot on econometric evidence, but you also have to say, okay, what are the special factors we need to take into account? And then it leads to issues about how can you have disinflation without a recession? I mean, that's always often that's a framing around the world. So just a reminder about where we think GDP is. So this graph I think is helpful. So the blue line is from the December 19 pre-pandemic projection, and compared to indexing GDP to be 100 at the end of 19, it said this is the boring but kind of positive path the euro area economy will be on. That was the expectation in 2019. And then, of course, the pandemic came along and there's a huge hit to output. On the other hand, there's been fairly rapid bounce back from that. And then the orange line is from the point of view of December 21, so a year and a half ago before the war. This is what we thought was coming next, which is essentially a rapid recovery, especially in 22, also in 23, and will be more or less back in the pre-pandemic trend. Then with the war, that has been shaken. And now, even though it looks better in March than it did in December with the reversal of the terms of trade shock, we do basically have a path for GDP which is very far away from the pre-pandemic trend. There's some element of that is a revision to potential output, but part of that is basically there is still a reopening of the European economy, a recovery from the pandemic. And this explains why the European economy should grow over time. And the fact we grew very little last year, there's going to be pretty subdued growth this year, is creating, if you like, the disinflation space. it's growing slowly compared to what the European economy should be growing like in this recovery phase. So the basic economics, there's a connection between disinflation and subdued activity. It is there. It's just you have to kind of make the appropriate adjustment. The same basic points relates to consumption and investment. And this is where there's a very big difference to the US. We didn't have this surge going above the pre-pandemic trend, which was true in the US. But it basically it says, if consumption has flatlined in recent months, we think it's going to grow fairly slowly in the near term. But there will be ongoing momentum because the European economy still has a lot of bounce back to do. Okay, so then where does that take us to inflation? And I've been using this graph because I think it captures quite a bit. So the solid blue line is headline, which we know has come, went to this spectacular peak and has come down, but it's still pretty high. The shaded blue area is the range of measures of underlying inflation. And underlying inflation in our world is supposed to basically say, where do we think inflation is going to be a year from now, let's say, or 2 years from now? And that's saying some number between 4 and 7. So then how do our own forecasts, and the different symbols are our forecasts, the survey of monetary analysts, the market-based measures, all of those basically say we don't believe the underlying inflation numbers. We believe there's extra disinflation coming. So they have, there's some range of variation by 2024, exactly how quickly, but there's a pretty solid view by 25, inflation will be around 2. So it remains a lot to discuss, and of course, in the fine detail for monetary policy, it's very relevant for where exactly we go. But there is a basic question of, okay, tell me why these underlying inflation measures need some downward correction. Why can't we just take them at face value? And I'll come down in a minute, but just very quickly in terms of the components of inflation, because, economically we think what determines inflation in the traded sector is very different to what determines inflation in the non-traded sector. What determines inflation in relation to basically durables would be different to non-durables and so on. So that overall return of inflation to 2% has very different dynamics for different sectors. I mean, for energy, is energy inflation going to 0 this year on average, but which is right now a big negative number. For food, it's important because I think Giovanni had essentially a lot of peaking in 22 globally. But actually, for food and for core, for us, the peak is this year, not last year, because there is a kind of handover from or lagged effects. So we're on an annual basis, this is the peak year. But of course, it'd be nice to move beyond the peak, to have the reassurance that these are coming down. And the same for core. As Giovanni said, I mean, one of the big issues is, there's 2 different profit dynamics to keep track of. One is in the pandemic itself with the lockdowns, the surge in demand for goods globally, and the supply bottlenecks did create an amazing profit opportunity. And then there's a second phase when the European economy reopened. Then the services sector, which is, was not making money in the pandemic as such, except through maybe government transfers. In the last 9 months of last year and the opening of this year, the services sector has seen a resumption of demand, and there are supply constraints which were most intense last year, which helped to build up profits. And again, to the extent this surge in profitability should not be maintained, it does mean as wage increases and so on should not pass 1-for-1 into higher prices this year. And so as an example, also even within services, the reopening sectors are disproportionately contributing a lot at the moment. So if you connect travel, tourism and restaurants, their contribution to inflation over the last year has been way above normal. And this is one of the open questions about, is this going to normalize? And let me highlight with restaurants, there's a tight connection between restaurant prices and food prices. So the high food inflation we're seeing will also be maintaining restaurant inflation. And again, we have food inflation reversing later this year, and in turn may help to calm down restaurant prices. On the right side, because the national account data are lagging and so on, we learn a lot from just asking firms directly. And in our corporate telephone survey, what they said most recently is the blue line said, yes, we made a lot of money last year. And the orange line is saying that's not going to persist this year. We have rising costs this year from wages, but we don't have the same pricing power as we had last year. So there is going to be this contribution, we think, from the compression of profits. Wages play a very important role, and again, explaining why, even though the original shock to energy is reversed, the pandemic, the bottlenecks are reversing, the pandemic reopening should ease over time. What we have is there is a catch-up process. So real wages, even this year, will remain below their 2019 levels. So even though the labour market is tight in many European countries, the shock to real wages last year from surprise inflation was so big, and the labour market is sufficiently inertial, it doesn't correct all at once. It's a gradual process, but crucially for disinflation, what we have is a negative slope. So the left side is nominal wages, which are going way above normal for the next several years. But basically, the most intense wage correction is this year, because the real wage gap is largest this year. So and on average for the euro area, it has nominal wages going above 5% this year, 4 something next year, and 3 something in 25, all above steady state. But all of that only brings real wages back to 2019 levels in 25. So we do think there's upside risk to this. This is a judgment. It's a judgment that, when you take the euro area as a whole, is, I think, a reasonable judgment. But it's also reasonable to say, well, let's see what the data will tell us. On the right side, we have this wage tracker data, and it's telling us two things. Basically, on average, wages are rising in a very moderate way. Many people are still locked into old contracts. They're not being renegotiated, instantly. So the overall wage dynamic remains moderate. The orange line is telling you the latest deal, which might be a good hint towards the future. And the latest deal is coming in as above 5%. But ballpark, it's what we expect. And remember, there's lots of differences. Boris had lots of differences across countries. And this is one area where there are differences across countries. But remember, what we essentially have is the overall inflation rate will be rising services inflation, declining goods inflation, declining food inflation. So it's a handover process. So this is in the March forecast. We go back to 2% price inflation, even though wage inflation is elevated for several years. The labour market, you could say, well, how it looks so tight, why do you not have much stronger wage pressure? Because essentially what we have is just this catch-up dynamic. It's basically mostly reflecting the restoring real wages, not that there's a big increase in real wages. And this is a bit different to the Blanchard-Bernanke study that Giovanni was referring. And the answer's on the right side, which is basically part of the recovery in Europe is a big recovery in the labour force, including a lot of immigration. So over the last year, employment has grown very strongly. But indicators of labour market tightness like vacancies or unemployment have not moved. In fact, vacancies have slightly eased. So in other words, if you add in a big labour supply positive effect, that helps to reconcile. And I would also join the conjecturing about working from home. One reason, because we're seeing a lot of older workers rejoin the labour force, and my bet is working from home helps with that. This is just to say the bottlenecks are easing, the energy shock is reversing, so I won't stop on that. I don't want to overrun time, so Boris made the point about momentum, which is basically momentum in relation to goods inflation, food inflation, and service inflation is still pretty high. So it's not the case right now. We can say, so I'm saying we expect to turn the corner, but I wouldn't say we've exactly left that corner quite yet. And then if you look at the underlying inflation, so you might say, well, there's some kind of temporary factors there. Let's look at the underlying measures. In relation to the underlying measures, some of them do see more of a drop in terms of momentum, but some of them are still pretty high. So it's a mixed picture. Let me, maybe I'll also say in relation to core, because there's this phrase going around, core is sticky. I don't really think this is the best analytical way to think about it. First of all, there's a big difference between goods inflation and services inflation. And second, one reason why core went up so much was every sector had to reprice because of the scale of the energy shock. Now the energy price has reversed. I don't think it's symmetric, but all the analysis does say over many years, when energy prices fall, core inflation does follow, because there is less pressure from energy costs, there's less pressure on the cost of living, and therefore on nominal wage increases. So we do think these spectacular reversal of energy prices will feed into lower core, but the timeline for that and the scale of it is uncertain. Okay, let me finish just quickly with the most basic point, but maybe I'm being a bit obtuse about the title of the seminar, which is, it's not all about exogenous processes. There is a policy lever, and the policy lever we've used quite a bit. So in December 21, the orange line is what people thought, low for long. The policy rates would be only converging towards zero from below, even in 2025. We're not in that world. And that amount of tightening, we're seeing it in house prices, we're seeing it in credit dynamics, we're seeing it in flat consumption, we're seeing it in the slowdown in construction investment. But we do also have to do a lot of filtering for the reasons Boris said. It's an unusual period. The pandemic is not a baseline. The pre-pandemic is not a baseline either, because we had a lot of deleveraging before the pandemic and we had a low inflation problem. So working out what is a reasonable kind of baseline to think about is, of course, part of our work. And again, this is just telling you it's passing through. Let me make a comment about credit standards and this channel, because, and Giovanni said, look, there's some kind of mapping from financial conditions in general into policy rates. How the financial conditions tighten is maybe secondary to the fact they are tightening. But at the ECB, we do think it's credit, especially in the bank-based system, doesn't just work through the yield curve or through lending rates. Quantity restrictions do directly affect, basically, they ration credit, and they have a visible impact on GDP levels. So there's a kind of macro channel, not just through the interest rate. Okay, so let me stop there by basically saying, for given all of these reasons, this is why our policy guidance is so precise. We say we need to look at it remains the case, the anchor of the system is the projections. That brings all of these things together. This judgment calls, yes, so it's not the only thing we look at, but the projections, the outlook, and not just the base case, but also the risk outlook is important. It's important to accept that the persistence of inflation is uncertain, so we do have to observe and absorb what we learn from the underlying filter of the latest inflation data. And we also have not tightened very often, so we also accept there's uncertainty about the strength of monetary policy transmission and feedback from that. And all of that in context where there's lots of lags in the system. So what we've done so far, how much disinflation we've already injected, we'll have to keep an eye on. So I'm sure there's still plenty of room. I haven't answered the question conclusively there, so I'm sure the rest of the panel will finish the job now. So thank you.
Thank you both. Let's move to the BIS now. Marco Lombardi is with us here. The BIS has recently published a paper on the inflation, on a two regime of the inflation, so I'm sure Marco will give us a view of how the BIS thinks about it, although he will say that these are his personal, probably, views rather than institutional.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much for inviting me to this very distinguished panel. I'm really honored to be here. What I'm going to talk about today is a two-regime view of inflation. In spite of this being joint work with Claudio Borio and other BIS colleagues, James Yetman and Egon Zakrajsek, this is not really to be taken as the BIS view on the matter of inflation, even though I should say that this, what I'm going to present today largely reflects last year's annual economic report, which you can check for your reference. So what we did in this work is to try to characterize the inflation process in terms of two regimes to be able to shed light on the recent puzzle, if you want, of more persistent than expected inflation. And this is a simple outline of how we characterize these two regimes. In a low inflation regime, aggregate inflation, HICP or CPI, is largely the result of independent sectoral price movement, largely independent across each other. This means that these unrelated movement in sectoral prices generate relative price changes across the different goods, but have little commonality among themselves. This also implies that all these sectoral price changes, given that they happen randomly in this regime, they tend to cancel each other and therefore have a only transitory impact on aggregate inflation readings. And even more importantly, that this type of inflation does not really feed into wage demands from the side of workers. There's two reasons why we think this is the case. One is that when inflation is low, agents can be inattentive to inflation, even in a rational way. And the second is that when inflation is low and driven mainly by relative price changes, it could be the case that different actors in the economy, based on their different consumption basket, they face very different personal inflation rates. And so the aggregate inflation rate does not really represent the increases in the cost of living of all workers, nor in the cost of input for firms. This environment is very benign for monetary policy because monetary policy can afford quite a great deal of flexibility in that world. By flexibility, I mean that if inflation is stable, mainly driven by these idiosyncratic sectoral price changes, policymakers can tolerate moderate, if not too persistent, deviations from the inflation target. On the other hand, things are very different in a high inflation regime. In a high inflation regime, aggregate inflation reflects most of the prices moving together in the same direction. If you want, if you allow me a more academic take on this, there's a very nice research by Rice and Watson in which they labeled this sort of inflation where all prices move at the same time by the same amount as pure inflation. In this world, the prices move together, so there's high commonality across price changes. And importantly, there's stronger and more extensive price spillovers across different categories. And stronger feedbacks between wages and prices. Because in this world, the aggregate inflation rate becomes more of a coordinating device according to which both workers and firms set their own demands. This is, of course, a challenging world for monetary policy, and here prompt and forceful monetary policy reaction to this type of inflation is called for. So let me now bring to the table some empirical insights on how we can characterize these two regimes. And the first piece of evidence I want to touch upon is the role of a common factor underlying inflation. In these two graphs, you see a bunch of lines. The black one is the most important one. That's the percentage of the variance that the common factor of inflation explains, the variance of all sectoral price changes. The left-hand panel is for the US, and the right-hand panel is for Mexico. We picked these two countries because there's decent sector data coverage in that. And you can see that in both cases, the black line declines together with the level of inflation. That's the orange dashed line in the graph. So that happens roughly in the mid-90s for the US, much later in the, after 2010 for Mexico. And interestingly, if you see in Mexico, the decline of the relevance of the common component starts when inflation crosses the 10% threshold. So if you want to say that in other words, when the central bank has established some credibility in fighting inflation. Now let me move to another feature that distinguishes high and low inflation regime, and that's the inflation volatility. Now this is well known and well documented that the high inflation regime is associated with high volatility of inflation. This is pictured here in the graphs where the total variance of inflation is the black line. What is a bit less appreciated is the fact that when inflation declines and is brought under control by the central bank, so you want to say, the decline in the volatility of inflation is driven mainly by a decline in the covariance of the sector price development, rather than by a decline in the individual variances of sector price changes. So all this reduction in the volatility of inflation is mainly due to less commonality across price changes, which sits nicely with our story of with our characterization of the low inflation regime. Finally, what happens in a low inflation regime compared to a high inflation regime is a reduction in the cross-sectoral price spillovers. Here, these two graphs represent, these two matrices represent a way to measure spillovers across PCE sectors in the US. And you see two estimates. The one on the left is based on a period of high inflation, 69 to 84. The one on the right is on a period of lower inflation. It goes up to 2019. First thing I want to draw your attention on is that the matrix on the right-hand side is much less colored than the one on the left, signaling that there's less spillovers from one PCE sector to the other. The second thing that I think it's interesting to remark is that while in the left-hand panel the matrix has dark colors a bit all over the place, meaning that these spillovers are pervasive and go from all categories to and transmit from most categories of the PCE prices. In the right-hand panel, the spillovers are concentrated in two columns. You see the darker ones, one being food and the other one being gasoline. And interestingly, the darkest element there is food to food services, which is what Philip just mentioned. Okay, so take away from this graph, a low inflation regime, there is less cross-transmission of shocks between the sectors. So in general, a shock originating in one specific sector is much less pervasive than in a high inflation regime. Now let me move to the other key element that drives the inflation persistence. That is the relationship between wages and prices. If you want, in other words, the possibility that high inflation will ignite a wage price spiral, whatever you want to define it. Here we have some evidence that suggests that in a low inflation regime, wages are less sensitive to inflation and vice versa. The left-hand panel of this graph shows an estimate of the sensitivity of wage growth to past inflation. That's based on advanced economy data. And we have different overlapping sample periods. You see that the sensitivity is positive and statistically significant up to the moment where the 80s and the 70s exit the estimation sample. So we achieve some low level of inflation. And the similar considerations apply on the right-hand panel for what concerns the sensitivity of inflation to past wage growth. So let me skip that one in the interest of time. That was some other insights on wage-price relationship. So this brings me to the question that we're trying to tackle in the panel, that is, where do we stand now and what is the outlook of inflation? So at the BIS, we don't have our own forecast of inflation, so we just try to provide more of insights, if you want. And based on what I said, here the insight is that the outlook for inflation looking ahead is clearly determined and shaped by whether we are in a low inflation regime, as we were pre-COVID, or we are transitioning towards a high inflation regime. So what I will try to point here is some insights into this very difficult question. As I said, one key defining feature of a low inflation regime is that there is little price similarity across price changes in different sectors. This is indeed something that you can clearly appreciate from the left-hand panel of this graph. Here we plot on the y-axis an index of similarity in price changes for a bunch of advanced and emerging market economies, and for a sample period that depends on the individual data availability but covers both high and low inflation phases. And this is plotted against the level of inflation on the x-axis. So you see that there's a clear positive relationship between these two variables, and it's even stronger. It gets stronger and stronger as inflation increases, of course, and it applies to both advanced and emerging market economies. So this index of similarity is something we can try to use to gauge whether we're moving towards a high inflation regime, or if you want, if risks of transitioning towards a high inflation regime are actually growing. And this is something we show in the right-hand panel of this graph. So here the box and whiskers red plots correspond to the historical distribution of the similarity index between 2012 and 2019. And then the orange dots and the blue dots represent respectively the readings in 2021 and 2022 of SAID index. You see that throughout 2021, the orange dots were more or less in line with the historical distribution, although a bit skewed towards the upper tail. And in 2022, especially in advanced economies, there are clear signs that these measures of the similarity index are going a bit off the historical values. So this is potentially a sign that risks of transitioning towards a high inflation regime, and therefore having all the negative effects of a high inflation regime are growing. Another reflection of these growing risks is the increasing persistence of inflation, which here we show for both advanced and emerging market economies in relationship to the persistence in the pre-COVID years. You see that most of the points are above the 45 degrees line, signaling that current estimates of persistence are ticking up. That's another sign that things are moving. Now let me wrap up and recap what I just said. So what we try to do in this work is to characterize inflation in terms of two regimes, with a view that this characterization and which is largely based on a granular approach to look at different sectoral prices, can provide useful insights in the current conditions. Now, of course, the key challenge, and that's something for which we don't have an answer, is that the transitions between one regime and the other are inherently uncertain. And there's no reliable, fully reliable real-time indicator that tells you whether you are in a regime or in the other one, or at what point of the transition you might be. And this is especially problematic because if you want, if you have established that you are in one regime or the other, you can use historical evidence, if available, to figure out where inflation is heading and when it's going to come back. During a transition, it is much more difficult because there's no standard model that can accommodate these two different states of the world. So the policy implications that we draw from this work and from these considerations is that in a world in which transitions are getting increasingly risky and increasingly threatening, sound judgment in the conduct of monetary policy comes at a premium. So far, central banks have acted forcefully and reacted promptly to the growing inflation pressures. So this is part of what we refer to as sound judgment and promptness in action to respond to challenges. I think I can stop here.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you. And finally, let's have a view from the private sector. Andreas.
All right. Good morning, all. Thanks for the governor and thanks for the central bank for inviting me back. That's typically a good sign. So let's see next year. And the reason that I'm saying that is, I guess that we're slightly more skeptical on what you've heard so far. I'm not trying to be too skeptical, but I want to show a couple of wrinkles here that I think matter. So there's a bunch of charts that you will have seen now, different variations of, so I'll go through quickly. The bottom line of this chart and the next chart is essentially that inflation expectations, headline inflation expectations, are anchored. And another way is sort of, what we did on the left here is pulling together the forecasts of sort of the institutions here on the panel that actually do forecast headline inflation. So we see that the ECB is a touch lower than the fund and where we are. And then on the right, we also show you a chart that actually focuses in on core inflation, which we think the action really is. So that's the interesting economic conversation when you're coming out of an energy price shock that's sort of whipping headline inflation all over the place for a number of years. So the point of the right chart is that if you compare the ECB forecast both in the December round or projection round and in the March round, is that we're 30, 40 basis points above. And that includes the end of the forecast horizon. And the point I'm trying to make here is that this is probably one of the very few instances in economics where 20 basis points, so call it 2.2 as a core inflation forecast a few years out, is significantly different from 2. Not so much because of the estimate, but because of the policy communication that is behind it. So why is monetary policy tricky right now? Why is the disinflationary process not straightforward? So on the left, we just want to zoom in a little bit to give you a flavor for what's going on here. So on the left, you have core inflation, the darker line, and that is going down during the course of this year, but there's a bump in the summer. And that bump in the summer has to do with sort of one-off effects, both last year, so base effects, but then also this year. And that has to do, again, with something very specific, namely the introduction of subsidized transport ticket, general transport ticket in Germany. So you can see that single policy measures really have a massive impact on the Eurozone-wide core inflation trajectory. And so I think the takeaway here is that this is what makes communicating about monetary policy and also sort of thinking about the macroeconomics behind it in the context of core inflation particularly tricky. So if you take out transport from Eurozone core inflation, so the left, this is all our internal forecasts, then you see that the decline is relatively monotonous, whereas if you leave it in, you have a bump that you need to explain if you want to go there. And so that's one sort of element of why sort of this disinflationary process is quite tricky and not straightforward to communicate. On the right, you see a chart that a number of speakers have already talked about in many ways, and that is sort of service inflation being the last man standing, if you want, for an inflationary process. Up until a little while, there was also non-energy industrial goods inflation, but that has presumably turned. But service inflation, we're still waiting for that to turn. Now, yes, inflation, including core inflation, will go lower. The question is, how confident can we be? So the ECB publishes a significant number of underlying inflation measures, and they probably produce many more that they don't publish. In this chart, I have used a few one that they publish, two that they publish, and a couple that we do on the side. And essentially, the idea here is that sort of the underlying sort of leading measures, like the PCCI in yellow, show you that there should be a turning point in core inflation. Now, this is up to March, and I don't think that this picture looks particularly convincing about that turning point. So now, if you add April data, see what I did here? Very fancy. I think you can be ever so slightly more positive about the dynamic, but it's still not, a slam dunk that we're going to go lower and to target in a reasonable amount of time. Now, we've also already talked about a couple of interesting factors, distinguishing factors on core inflation. I think here, to recap, the wages obviously play a significant role in this process. Typically, the narrative is that a 3% wage increase is consistent with 2% core inflation 4 quarters later, or something along those lines. Now, the problem that we have is that the ECB's forecast for employee compensation 2 years out, in 2025, is still 3.5%. And Philip showed you that in a chart. Now, we also believe that that might be lowballing it a little bit, in the sense that wage dynamics in certain countries have probably surprised to the upside over the last 2 months. So we actually see that getting revised up. Now, we've also talked about margins that are quite high, profit margins that are quite high, and that should enable real wages to grow while not having a large impact on inflation. And that's true, but I think the takeaway here is that this is quite differentiated across countries. So on the left, I'm showing you here wages in the dashed lines are wages, where you see Germany wages having shot up quite a bit. But also Italian wages now slowly starting to creep up. So one of the big surprises coming out of this COVID shock was that Italian wages didn't really do much in response to inflation. It has to do with the way the indexation works. But now they're starting to pick up. So the question is, how much are they going to pick up? The solid lines on the left is a sort of something that we constructed as a simplistic measure of profit margin or pricing power, if you want. And that has obviously gone down a lot during the pandemic and has been coming back up. And that is, if you want, the cross-country way of looking this, that Philip showed you, the cross-sectoral way of looking at it. So agriculture, energy, where profit margins have been particularly high. Now, why am I showing this? Because this is what makes monetary policy right now very complicated, and what makes sort of the amount of certainty that you need to be convinced that inflation comes back to the target in a timely manner, quite complicated. The chart on the right makes precisely that point, in the sense that the German manufacturing, the margin, so this is a measure that essentially compares output prices with input prices in the purchasing manager index data. So this is essentially the impression that purchasing managers have on what they can push through in terms of output prices versus what they need to take in terms of input prices. That has rebounded quite a bit in specific sectors in specific countries. For example, Germany manufacturing, but that's not the case elsewhere, where it has just sort of come back to normal. So the takeaway here is that this disinflationary process that we're talking about is quite complex, both in terms of the mechanics of it, near term, medium term, and also a large variation across countries, which the ECB obviously cannot, well, needs to take into account, but cannot really speak too much about, because the ECB looks at aggregate data, and that's the job definition. So I guess the takeaway here is that, oh yeah, that's the slide you've all been waiting for. The takeaway really overall is that, yes, from a market side, we agree that inflation is going to come lower. In fact, that is what's priced into inflation markets which deal with headline inflation. But I think the underlying narrative in terms of core inflation and core inflation dynamics and what goes into it is a lot more complicated. And so to the extent that that matters in terms of monetary policy communications, we're in a very, very tricky spot, and we would probably, net, we would probably think that inflation comes down a little bit less quickly than what you've heard so far from the other speakers.
Thank you, Andreas.